Good morning, Australia. Good evening. No, let me try that again. Good evening, Australia. Good morning, Europe. And hello to anyone else who's joining from other parts of the world at other times of the day. I'm Susie Robinson. I'm the Executive Director of the Australian Plant Phenomics Facility, and that's my honour to open our proceedings for the final day, day 3 of the conference. It's been a really excellent and very interesting conference so far, and I'm informed that the networking session that's just happened immediately prior to this had some most interesting discussions as well around things that we all seem to find we stumble over and share in terms of challenges and opportunities. So thanks again to everyone for their participation and interest and for making it such a worthwhile event. I'm going to just start. In Australia, we often do a welcome to country and acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet. I'm based on Kaurna country in South Australia, but recognising we've got people joining us from all around Australia, I'm going to give just a slightly more general welcome to country, just acknowledging and paying respect to the past, present and future traditional custodians and elders of this nation, and the continuation of cultural, spiritual and educational practices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. It's my pleasure today to open our first session for day 3, which is a fireside chat with two people who are known very well to me. Marin, who is the Chief Executive of one of our NCRIS facilities, and I'll give you a little bit more information about Marin in just a moment. She's going to be our host for this fireside chat, and our victim, I'm going to call her, for the fireside chat is one of our government senior officials who is very well known to the Australian NCRIS community, and I certainly think also the international community, given her participation in a role of global activities. But I'm just going to start by introducing Marin to you all. Marin Smith is the Chief Executive of Australia's Population Health Research Network, or PHRN, and she's been in this role since establishment of PHRN in 2009. As I mentioned, it's one of the National Collaborative Research Infrastructure Strategy facilities, and it's based on provision of sensitive, linked health and human services data in privacy preserving ways that support a wide range of health, human services and related research. It works collaboratively with a wide range of organisations, both in Australia and elsewhere. Marin herself is based in Perth at the University of Western Australia. She served as a chair and member of a number of national and international boards and committees in this area. And currently, she's a member of the governing board of the International Population Data Linkage Network and is a member of the OECD Working Group on Integrated Care. She's also a member of the board of one of our other Australian NCRIS facilities, the Pawsey Supercomputing Centre. Marin is very passionate about the ongoing development of Australia's rich information resources for the benefit of the population. I can attest to that because I've heard her in action many times. So many thanks, Marin, and welcome into the seat as our host for the session. Marin's going to be interviewing and in discussion with Carolyn. Carolyn, do you want to just give us a wave? People will be able to spot you on the screen, and hopefully you'll appear somewhere prominently. Carolyn's the Assistant Secretary in the Department of Education, Skills and Employment. She's currently responsible for the development of the University Research Commercialisation Scheme, work around optimising value from publicly funded research in Australia is an area of high interest to our government currently. So Carolyn's undertaking this really important work at present. She previously to that held responsibility for the Research Policy and Programs branch in the Higher Education Division, and was ably, if you like, what we call the lady in charge of all the NCRIS things. So we've missed her while she's been temporarily off on her other role, and look forward to seeing her back as soon as we can. She's worked in the federal government in that department since 2006. And has had responsibilities for a wide range of work, ranging from schools, funding, strategic policy, oversight of ministerial working groups, and reforms to quality teaching and so forth. I won't give you any more information than that about Carolyn, and no doubt Marin is going to ask her all sorts of useful things about her perspectives and experience. So I will hand over to them and declare the session open.
Okay, well, look, thank you very much, Susie. It's great to have the opportunity to talk to Caroline in this way. I know Caroline's based in the east of Australia, so it's sort of early afternoon in Perth where I am. It's getting towards evening and nearly time for a drink for Caroline in Canberra. This session is a relatively short session. It's a bit of a change in format, so it's really sort of a Q&A session with Caroline drawing on her expertise as Australia's representative on the group of senior officials on global research infrastructure. And I encourage you to join in the conversation on chat as we go through, in case you've got some ideas or thoughts on some of the issues that we're going to cover. So perhaps to start with, Caroline, as you are a member of the GSO, and not all of our audience is going to be aware of the work that the group does, could you provide us with an overview of the GSO and its role in fostering engagement between research infrastructures?
Thanks, Marin, and thank you for the lovely invitation to join you this afternoon. You, with all of your work in research infrastructures, are more familiar than I am with the kind of work that the researchers are looking to use your facilities for. You know better than I that there are, there's global challenges and complex science problems, research problems that we need to solve across the world. And in a lot of instances, actually, we need to be thinking about what are those research infrastructures that the community needs to be able to solve those problems. What's the best way to kind of make sure that they're available? And you also are aware that different infrastructures cost different kind of have different costs to them. The group of senior officials is effectively a grouping of countries comprised of obviously Australia, Brazil, Canada, China, France, Germany, India, Italy, Japan, Mexico, Russia, South Africa, UK, and the USA. Who come together have been coming together twice a year to really talk about some of the greater challenges that the research community and the infrastructures that are needed to support solving some of those really big challenges in front of us. We also are sharing experiences about investment decisions, about collaboration, learning from each other, identifying good practice, really interesting conversations about emerging areas of investment need, areas that maybe not, needing as much attention, some evolutions in things. Data management's a great example, better connectivity of data and all those sorts of things. I feel like I've frozen.
Well,
frozen? No, the screen's frozen, but I can hear people, so that's all right. Really just an international community really looking at how to better support the research community through the research infrastructure that's available both domestically and internationally, Marin.
Well, that's a useful overview, because obviously that's drawing on some European nations, but also other nations in that broader context. So could you perhaps comment on the extent to which Australia already engages in that broader global network, and then later we can come and think a little bit about how we actually engage with Europe, which has been a particular focus of the discussion over the last 2 days.
Yeah, sure. So I very quickly went back out to the team who have all of the data and stats for all of these things. Obviously, being out of the space since January, there's a little bit of time gap, but there are 42 MOUs in place with international research infrastructure providers from Australian research infrastructures from the 24 that we have. I'm told there are 60 other formal arrangements, along with 69 informal agreements. I'm not sure what the difference is between the two. There's 48 visits from international bodies who frequently are seeking advice from our infrastructures. And we have 52 research infrastructure facility bodies involved in projects. Now, this is just from a research infrastructure to research infrastructure perspective. This is before you start to take into account other government level MOUs around research cooperation and research programs. It doesn't take into account agreements between relevant research councils here and internationally. It doesn't take into account also the direct people-to-people engagement that is critical to having those research infrastructures utilised and producing the amazing outcomes that come out of them. So there is a lot of engagement between Australia and international infrastructure, and a lot of engagement between here and European infrastructure as well. I'm particularly mindful that there's a lot of infrastructure that just through sheer economies of scale Australia can't have, but are present in Europe. And so our research community draws on those quite heavily. And similarly, there's a lot of expertise here running our research infrastructures and supporting and around our research infrastructures that I know that there's a lot of European researchers taking advantage of quite a lot of the time. So really strong engagements between here and Europe and vice versa.
Okay, well, thank you. That sort of frames an extent of agreement that's probably even greater than I thought in terms of formal agreements, informal agreements and visits. So that's remarkably healthy. What do you actually see as the priorities for global research infrastructure collaborations?
I think that if we kind of go back to some of the reasons the GSO exists, it's about ensuring that that we have world-class research infrastructures available to promote high-quality research. There are particular areas, as I've said, where international cooperation on global challenges is critical. Climate change is the obvious example. Or there are examples where it just makes sense to pool those investments to secure the best value for money. So, how many Large Hadron Colliders do we actually need? Probably the one that we've got's probably okay. If you look at the SKA being developed, the small square kilometre array facilities that's being developed between Australia and South Africa, but it's being managed out of the UK, for the type of ambition those infrastructures have, it has to be done with some degree of international collaboration and cooperation. So there's a really, really interesting kind of challenge around those things, how we make them available. There's also a really interesting question and discussion to have about when it makes sense to have some distributed research infrastructures. And again, the SKA is a great example of that, because there will be what we affectionately call the Christmas tree arrays set up in Perth, more traditional astronomy kits set up in South Africa, and then all of that kind of running through systems that are being managed out of Manchester. So again, looking at different models, what's best fit for what the research community needs alongside cost, but what also keeps us at the cutting edge, both from a national perspective, but also an international perspective, to start to really give researchers the opportunity to answer some of those really complex problems that we know need to be solved.
Well, thank you. That's a very sort of comprehensive response, and I think you're right in terms of how there are some things that exist at a huge scale and the world just needs one, and there are other things that are also at large scale but can best be done in some sort of distributed system. So I think that's quite useful in terms of framing some of the conversation. But now to think about the collaborations between Australia and Europe. Given the composition of the audience we've got at this meeting today, what do you think about the patterns of engagement, the existing patterns of engagement between Australia and Europe?
Oh, look, it's really interesting having stepped away from the research infrastructure and kind of research policy into a much more boutique kind of area of research at the moment, because even if we're talking about research commercialisation, it's really clear to me that there's strong engagement between Australia and Europe. You know, if I think about the representation of countries on the GSO, there's really strong engagement from a research infrastructure perspective. There's really strong kind of movement and engagement between researchers both here and into Europe. But I also know that business is really engaged in the research activity in Europe and really keen to see that grow here. You know, research has quite often been part of the European Australian Business Council meetings. I know this in part because the chair of the expert panel I'm working with at the moment, Jeff Connolly's chair of Siemens in Germany, but also on that particular council. So they're also, you know, business communities interested in what research is doing, both here and in Europe, and also in terms of the research infrastructure that's available to support that. Importantly, it's, I think, really, really critical that we remember that the success of those collaborations are based on the relationships between the people, and that, you know, while there's that long list of different types of agreements that are in place, you know, none of those work, whether they're formal or informal, without the people that are sitting underneath them. So how we are enabling people to connect and then utilise and access the research infrastructures is really critical. Without the people, without the relationships, then, you know, there are just buildings full of kit just sitting there waiting to be used. So now that we're moving away from people, well, now that we're in a situation where people can't come and visit and do that easily, hopefully that will change soon. We've become more reliant on them doing that virtually. It's brought with it different challenges, I think, as people start to engage in different ways. And I think that's one of the challenges that we have moving forward about how do we leverage off people doing more of this Zoom face-to-face kind of virtual connection, but also then moving to travel coming back and people wanting to then be able to travel and see and experience and just immerse themselves in not only being able to use your infrastructures, but also collaborate with the people that so often then gather around them to utilise them.
Okay, well, look, thanks for that reflection. And in your comments, I think you've probably answered one question we had from Luke, which was, has COVID impacted on cooperation, or are we able to sort of manage without the usual travel? And I think what you're saying, it's a little bit from column A and a little bit from column B, that we have obviously managed by doing things virtually, but it probably isn't ultimately a substitute for getting around a table and having a meeting, or possibly having a glass of wine and dinner, or being together in a conference session and standing in a queue for a coffee and striking up a conversation.
Yeah, I think that's right, Marin. I think one of the things we were, from the department's perspective, monitoring as COVID started to hit and all of the borders started to kind of close down, was impact through to utilisation of the infrastructures within Australia. You know, by and large, I think we didn't have the drop-off in utilisation that we were expecting. Now, it was impacted by the number of people who could go into the buildings to run the infrastructures every day. But I think one of the things we saw in Australia, and I'm sure European colleagues would have had similar experiences, is people thinking laterally about how to actually then make sure the community was still able to access and do the things that they needed to do. And so it saw different operating hours, it saw different kind of access arrangements, different responses that actually provided some agility and innovations into the way the infrastructures are run as well. So I think that was an unexpected outcome that actually is one that we should try not to lose as we move forward and we move back to more travel and more kind of face-to-face collaboration as well.
There was a related question in the chat, and you may not know the answer to this, but it said, this is from Karina Kemp, wondering how many of the MOUs and collaborations that you identified were actually formed in the last 18 months. So I guess it's whether having to work virtually has been good or bad, or perhaps neutral for those collaborations.
You're right, Marin. I don't know the answer to that one. I'm happy to take it on notice and get back to Karina at some later point in time.
It's an interesting idea. So perhaps moving on to thinking about opportunities for engagement, greater engagement between Australia and European research infrastructure. What do you think are the main benefits from that engagement? And do you think there are any major barriers?
There's definitely always barriers. Look, I think that, one obvious benefit of the engagement is that when you are talking to others, when you're having that direct engagement on your particular problem, you get help in solving it. Now whether that's you're on the wrong path, or have you thought about this, or actually that looks like it's like you get help, and what you're doing becomes better as a consequence. One of the challenges, obviously, at the moment is just not being able to sit down, as you say, with a glass of wine and do that. One of the pieces of work that's going on within the Australian government at the moment is the development of the 2021 National Research Infrastructure Roadmap. So for European colleagues, we go through a process every 5 years to refresh the broad strategic mapping process or direction for our research infrastructure investment. And that's going on at the moment. I know that there are similar processes that are undertaken both at a national level, internationally, but also internationally through ESFRI and other kinds of organisations. And so we're in the middle of doing that now. From the survey that the team undertook as part of the development of that work earlier in the year, the obvious main barriers to international collaboration came up. So things like lack of funding, the cost of travelling to and from Europe, both for us to go to you and for you to come here, was the highest mentioned barrier between in terms of accessing research infrastructures. Obviously, travel restrictions were going to be top of mind at the moment for everybody, and so risks with then not being able to get home, particularly back into Australia. Resourcing, time available for staff, lack of communication and clarity around what kind of infrastructures are available, where and how can you get access to using them, was one of the things that was mentioned quite a lot of time. Privacy and security got mentioned. And obviously data sharing and the ability to secure and safely share or transfer large volumes of data. All of those things are barriers, but I don't think any of those barriers are unique to Australia. I think our international colleagues would say that they've been wrestling with some of those things as well. Granted, cost of travelling through Europe is slightly cheaper than the cost of travelling out to Australia. So might be a slight difference between Australia and Europe in that context.
Okay, thanks. So there's certainly some barriers, but as you say, they're not really insurmountable. They just need perhaps some more resourcing, a little bit more effort.
Yeah.
Do you think there are things that Australia can do, so from our end, that we can do to support greater engagement with European infrastructures? And I'm thinking that could be at different levels, including at the international level and the way we're doing today, at a national level, say within a capability in a particular country, or at the individual research infrastructure level. And we've certainly heard some exemplars of that, particularly in global bioimaging and the mouse phenomics. There's some great international exemplars of that.
Yeah, I think if I sort of think about that question at a really kind of broad level, Marin, I think one of the things we don't do well just generally is communicate the success stories around our research and around our research infrastructure. I know that the NCRIS network is excellent here at giving the department really good examples of successes that you've seen move through your infrastructures. But even in the current work I'm doing now, it's really clear that we don't do a great job of sharing those success stories more broadly. Now, I'm not saying that in a flippant way. There's a lot of challenge with how we can get and share those good practices and those good stories to the wider community. But I think for us to change some of the the perceptions around the research, perceptions about, you know, why this is so important. We've really got to work together to try and increase the visibility of the amazing things that happen through our research community and through the infrastructures that we all invest in as well. So I think that's probably one of the things that we can all do better. I think that, you know, and that's both a challenge for both domestic research, domestic community, as well as internationally. And I think then sharing those opportunities and those stories to help increase that visibility is something that actually then is really, really critical. The team tell me also that there had been some feedback from the survey for the roadmap around some of the cultural challenges that we have in Australia. Australia is can be particularly competitive in some areas of research, and so I think there's some self-reflection we need to do as a community along some of those lines, because it does impact on open communication, knowing who's doing what and where to go to do that and progress things. It can be difficult. And also then making sure people have got time allocated to true collaboration as well, I think is a challenge. But I really think if I think back along the time that I've spent working in and around the research space, sharing those success stories, telling people about all of the amazing things that the infrastructures support is just, it's one of those things that we've just got to keep doing and get better at and do more of.
Well, thanks. That's a very interesting reflection. And as you say, communication's key. And I think that I live in Perth, and sometimes people that live in Sydney or Melbourne think Perth's a very long way away. And I think if you're in Europe, Australia does seem a long way away. And Australians are actually pretty used to travelling. We travel across the country and we're often off in Europe. And I think that perhaps the Europeans are not quite so used to travelling in the other direction to come out to this part of the globe. And so that was sort of a useful reflection on what Australia might do more about to engage with Europe. Do you have any thoughts on perhaps what the Europeans might do to better engage with us? I know that's a loaded question, and perhaps the Europeans have got something to add there as well.
I don't know. I'd be interested to see what their responses were to that question, Marin. I guess if I think about it, you know, do they know what we have here? You know, do we actually do a good job of letting people know the infrastructures, the opportunities that we have here that they can access, and the research communities that have been built up around the infrastructures that we have here? To entice people to travel this far, you need to be really clear about what the opportunities are. And it's not just necessarily you know, you can get time on this particular piece of equipment to do these particular things, but these are the other people that can help you work through that. These are the other experiences that you will have. So I do think there is something in still even just that. Do people know what we have here? And if we can answer that, that might help.
Well, thanks. I think that's an excellent response, and I think that's a very good note on which to finish this session. And perhaps one of the answers is demonstrated by RI-VIS. So certainly that's come from the EU. They've reached out to us through a process, and I think it's been enormously helpful, because I've certainly learned a lot by sitting in for the last 2 days, and I'm sure everybody else has, with a little bit more to learn today. And I think that's an example of the EU reaching out to us and to others, and hey, we should do it more often. So look, on that note, particular thanks to you, Caroline, for joining this from lockdown in the eastern states of Australia. And thanks to everybody who's participated in this session and also in the chat. I think there's been some useful discussion there as well.